A warm welcome to this introduction lecture for using the R package Selectiongain to optimize your breeding schemes. This is part 1, where I want to show you how the package works and how it's built up, a bit the background of the formulas. My name is Longin and I lead the research group Wheat at the University of Hohenheim, where we deal a lot with optimization of breeding programs. First of all, some guidelines. The copyright of this presentation, it can be used for internal training purposes. However, it's not allowed to publish it or any part of it without prior written agreement of the author. Liability. This presentation was built up very carefully. Nevertheless, the author takes no liability on the correctness of any result or data shown. The targeted audience are plant breeders and students in plant breeding. Why is such a package needed? First of all, you are a breeder or you're interested to be a breeder, and I think it's really a cool job. You are somewhat like the head of product development in your company or in a university or wherever you work as a breeder. And that means on the one hand, you must be innovative. You must rapidly take decisions, but you define the strategies and you are responsible for whole the product chain. And in this product chain, at the end, like you see in the pictures, there are some nice varieties coming out here. We are responsible as a breeder for whole the product chain, and we get information in companies for our target framework. That means from the market where we have to breed for, the traits we shall work on, where we are poor, where we are strong, the economy of some steps. We will get this information from teams of the marketing, of the sales, of the seed production. But at the end, to achieve all these aims for my specific framework, this is my job, the breeder's job. And therefore I have to define the strategies. But which ones? There's quite a lot we have to think about. One backbone, our backbone, is the breeding scheme. But we can also think about, shall we use molecular markers? Do we have quality analysis? And if yes, which? How to manage our field trials? And especially the phenotyping on which trait at which location. The disease management. Do we need to phenotype on it, select on it? Or are there fungicide or whatever treatments which are more efficient and thus not important for ourselves to work on? Which priority has each trait? Many things, but most of them are the topic of other lectures. Here, in this lecture, and especially working with the Selectiongain package, we deal with the breeding scheme. But to my opinion, this is the backbone, my assurance that everything works like I want to have it. Let's make an example, a phenotypic selection scheme for hybrid breeding. Let's assume we do a cross of different parents in year 1. We produce the age lines from them. In year 3, we have the age line multiplication and a nursery observation in parallel. Then we go to hybrid seed production and afterwards to a first yield test. The best ones we select are once again to go to a hybrid seed production with more testers, and then we put them finally in a second yield test. And we can partitionate this breeding scheme into 3 stages or phases. Phase 1 is producing the new variation. That means making crosses in our case. Page 2, forming the varietal parents. It means making homozygous lines before we select by the age method here. And at the end we have the phase 3, where we test our experimental varieties. And on this phase I will focus now a bit more in detail. Looking at this phase, we have many questions. What shall we do? What is the best strategy? How many locations shall we use? How many testers? how many lines, how many years of field tests, and shall we use markers, and if yes, which and when? To answer these important questions, for me the most reliable thing as an applied breeder is let's test it in a field, because this is at the end what I want to sell. My wheat variety which is tested in the field, and the farmer will check its performance in their fields. That would mean, for instance, we run a breeding program like shown here, and we assume that we use the maximum number of lines at the expense of a minimum number of locations, because our budget is fixed. And we can then compare it to another scenario, the same scheme, but just vice versa. We maximize the number of test locations and at the expense of a reduced number of lines we can test. Or we say, let's try it a bit faster. Let's make only 1 year less field trials. We take a bit more risk, but we are faster. Maybe we can win. And to test this in the field, we would have to do it under the same conditions for each. That means the same budget for all, ideally even the same crosses. And looking at the time schedule here, would be one test requires 7 years. That means when I start now and I want to know the results, I have it in 7 years. And then I have it just from one run. Thus, I should even test it in different years. But that is clearly impossible to be done. I cannot wait 7 years to make important decisions. Especially when we make same crosses in different breeding schemes, this is not very effective use of money. Thus, it's well agreed that breeding schemes and their optimization must be done by simulation. We cannot do it in the field, thus we have to simulate it. It's not the full reality, but at least it's closer to reality, and we have data. Having data or some information is all the time better than having nothing. This simulation is normally done by the prediction of the gain from selection in the breeding scheme. That is the well-known breeder's equation. And this is then calculated for different breeding schemes, different allocation of resources. It's not new. This is a very old method, done already the last decades. But new is that you have now an R package available where you can deal a lot quite easily without requiring you to perform coding in R or wherever to run an optimization. The backbone of this package is that the selection gain is calculated and maximized. That means the target is I want to have the scenario where I can gain the highest selection gain for the invested budget. Thus, let's stick shortly to selection gain. Let's assume you have a quantitative trait which is inherited by many genes, all of them with a small effect. This will lead to a distribution of phenotypic values close to a normal distribution, like shown here. That means we have few individuals with low performance, few individuals with very high performance, and most of the individuals with intermediate performance. What we do at the end is we select the better fraction and continue this for further selection or for registration. Thus, the selection gain is at the end the difference between the mean of the selected population versus the mean of the entire population, multiplied by the heritability. And this difference, the mu of the selected fraction minus the total mu, is also called selection differential. However, this is post-test. That means we have phenotyped our genotypes, we have the data, and then we can assume it. But this is too late for me to estimate the value of a breeding progress. Thus, there is the pre-test scenario for selection gain where we predict the selection gain. And this is the well-known breeder equation, which is the selection gain is the product of the selection intensity multiplied by the square root of the heritability and multiplied by the square root of the variance of the target trait. And we can here differentiate between the absolute selection gain, which is shown here and defined already, and the annual selection gain, which is nothing else than taking the absolute selection gain and dividing it by the numbers of years we require to finish one breeding cycle. This is especially important when we compare breeding schemes where we have different length of breeding cycles. For instance, when we try to use genomic selection and assuming, for instance, that one selection based on genomics could replace 1 year of phenotyping. Thus, these two options are calculated in the same way, with the slight difference that the annual selection gain is at the end divided by the length of the breeding cycle. Very important, the selection gain package is built up on the assumption that the breeder has a fixed annual budget, which is for sure reality. But it's really important to stress it because I know numerous scientific studies which compare breeding schemes which don't use the same budget. But the aim of the package is at the end, you will give them a total budget and it has to use all. And then it's compared to scenario B, where also the same budget is completely used. And furthermore, it's important to notice when you have a breeding scheme, which is shown here, this example is a very easy pedigree scheme, with all the logistics behind, what traits are selected, the allocation of resources, some special nurseries, and on the left hand side the seed stock, how much seed is required where and how much is in the stock and when it's allowed to be skipped off. You get a budget, for instance, €500,000, and this is required to finish here one cycle. To start with a cross and end up here when you sell your lines to your commercial team. But the budget we have here horizontal is automatically your annual budget as well, because you don't have only one breeding scheme running. That means you don't have this year the crosses, next year the F1, and 1 year later the F2 and nothing else. You have the horizontal scheme also vertically. That means you cross, but you have the F1 from last year in the trials, you have the F2 from 2 years ago, the F3 from 3 years ago, and so on. That means your budget, what you have horizontal, it's also vertically, and the total amount of money you're allowed to spend this year is also the budget for the whole breeding program. Let's go a bit more how the modeling of the optimum allocation is realized in the selection gain package. As I told you already, we have a fixed budget which we define. And then we have here a basic level where we define the target criterion, the trait, breeding level where we define the scheme and the scenario, which just mean budget and others, and then we optimize. To look a bit more inside here, we could see the target criterion is our selection gain. The trait, we look on one trait only, is grain yield in wheat, for instance. The breeding level, we would define a breeding scheme would be as shown a phenotypic standard scheme without markers. In the scenario, we need variance components from grain yield in wheat. We need a budget, we need a selected fraction, all the technical requirements and costs. And then we go to the optimization level where the number of test locations, testers, replications, DH lines is optimized. How does it look like at the end? Whenever we define our basic level, we work on a selection gain. We don't have any alternative in the package. we look on grain yield, for instance maize or wheat in your crop. Then you define your breeding scheme, and then you define a given scenario. And for this given scenario means your variance component, your budget, your costs and everything. All the specific allocations which are possible are run in a such called grid search. We have the budget and we use the budget, maybe for instance investing all in a high number of lines and only at few locations with few testers, until the complete opposite, very many locations and testers and few lines. And this is done in a grid search. It looks like this. For each allocation, the target criterion is calculated. That means the selection gain. And the package runs hundreds of different allocations. And after 1-2 minutes, depending on your budget, the size of the budget, you will get the maximum selection gain in the scenario you have defined, and you will get back the allocation of resources at this situation, which would be at the end the optimum allocation, because it maximizes for your defined scenario the expected selection gain. We could also think about using molecular markers. Molecular markers is nothing else than an indirect selection. Let's assume our target trait is still grain yield measured in the field. And when we use molecular markers, we don't have anymore here the heritability, but we have the correlation between the indirect measurement, the genetic markers, and the phenotypic value. And when we look directly in the formula, it's sure that the correlation coefficient cannot be larger than 1. Thus, using indirect selection will all the time reduce our selection gain. And thus, it will only help us when we are able to increase the selection intensity, which would mean that we are able to run high throughput genotyping, many more lines genotyped, which we could not bring to the field to the same level. Or that we speed up our scheme. We have a faster recycling. And this I will show you in a few later slides. Thus what we need is, we have the genomic breeding value estimated by hundreds of markers, the phenotypic breeding value, and then we need the correlation between both, the so-called prediction ability. By the way, be careful, we need really the correlation between genomic and phenotypic value, which is the prediction ability. In many data sets and publications, there's the prediction accuracy given. But the prediction accuracy is the prediction ability divided by the square root of the heritability. Thus, if you have a paper or data where you have prediction accuracy, you have to reform it to the prediction ability. And for sure, you need, when you want to do genomic selection, this correlation between the genomic breeding value and your target value. In hybrid breeding would be GCA, general combining ability for grain yield. And you need the costs for genomic selection. And the future slides I show are based on these publications below. Here you can see a bit more details about the framework. Okay, that was a longer introduction to the general situation, and now let's go a bit more to the package. The R package Selectiongain is an open source package in R. You can just download it from CRAN. You have also, when you look here in the description, you can get a PDF, a manual, you can get examples. The manual here, you see there are all the functions explained, many details, and you have recent publications where you can look what I have done with the package and where you can try to re-simulate the data of these authors to check whether you are right or not, whether you have understand correctly the handling of the package. When you open a D&R, you must first download under Tools the package Selectiongain and install it, and then you're ready to use it. But before using it, you should know what is possible and what is not possible. And therefore, I show you here on the left-hand side the breeding scheme. This is the maximum what is possible. That means we make a cross, produce the age lines, multiply them, and put them in a first nursery. In the nursery, there's the number of the age lines there is called n-ini, for initial number of the age lines. Then we normally would do a selection here, and we reduce the number of initial age lines to an n1 number, which is put in genomic selection. By the genomics, we select once again, and the number n1 is changed to n2. And in n2, they are put to hybrid seed production with a given number of testers. These are called T2 because 2 means we are now in the stage where we have n2. It relates to the stage. For line breeding, for sure, you don't need this step. You can switch it off. I'll show you later. Then, after the seed production, you go to field test, and you once again we don't do any selection. That means you have the same number of genotypes, n2, here in the field test, n2 as well. And for testers, the same number, which have been done in seed production, also in the field. And a further multiplicator is the number of test locations. And for sure, if you want, you can also manipulate the number of replications. Then you, based on this data, you make a selection, and you make once again a second hybrid seed production with the better lines, the N3 lines now, with more testers. They are called T3 because it's stage 3 for the lines at least. And then at the end, there's no selection, but you bring them all to the field and make a final field test. This is the backbone. That means the breeding scheme, it focused on one trait only. And the most important trait would in most crops be yield. There's the DH production. We have a nursery selection on traits which are not correlated to yield. I'll show you later why. We can do genomic selection on yield. And we can do two-stage phenotypic selection on yield. And like shown, we can do hybrid seed production, or we can do without this hybrid seed production, then it would be line breeding, for instance. And here the numbers are the number of lines, locations, replications, and testers used in stage E. And they are not chosen freely by you as user. They are optimized based on the budget you give, and then the grid search starts and calculates all possible allocations regarding the budget and picks out the highest selection gain in that allocation, which is then called the optimum allocation for that scenario. Very important, I showed you the maximum which is possible, but you can switch off each stage. It means you can switch off nursery selection, you can switch off genomic selection, or you can switch off all the phenotypes, and here once again phenotyping in nursery, then you have only a genomic selection scheme. You can enter minimum or maximum numbers in each test stages regarding N, L, R or T. For sure, for genomic selection you can switch it off or on. The package assumes that as a breeder you have a fixed budget. That means you give the system a budget, for instance 500,000 euro, which are then you should transform it into field plot values. That means when a plot costs you 50 euro and you have 500,000 euro available, you have a budget of 10,000 plots. And from this budget, everything is built up. That means there are costs. N-ini are the initial number of DH lines which are produced. And these are the costs arise and costs for producing the DH line. And we have this N-ini in the nursery. That means also for testing them in the nursery, where we have also a seed multiplication in parallel. That means the number of initial lines is multiplied by the DH production costs for each line, multiplied by the test costs in the nursery for each line. Then we make a selection and we get the number of N1 better lines, which are in genomic selection. Thus they are multiplied by the costs for genotyping a single line. For sure, when you don't make genomic selection, you put here a 0 and then no costs will arise. Then you go to hybrid seed production, which are done after genomic selection. You have selected N2. You multiply this with the number of testers, T2, and multiply this by the costs to produce one hybrid combination. That means when you have 100 lines produced with one tester, you must multiply the cost of producing one hybrid by 100, which is finally done by the system. Then we go to field testing, where we have the number of lines, number of testers, number of field locations, number of replications at a single location, multiplied by the costs for this field test for a single line. That means all the costs you give the system are calculated on a single line or single plot basis. Then in the stage 3, you make a hybrid seed production once again. You have the number of lines, the number of testers multiplied by the costs of the hybrid seed production. But here you have an option I show you later. Normally we assume that one hybrid seed production is enough to produce seeds for 2 years of testing. That means for those testers, T2, you have produced already here seeds. You have the seeds also for the second test. You have only to pay for the additional testers you make in this stage. You can switch this off and on this function. And once again, we go to the field where you have the costs. And this is the backbone of the program, what it can do for you, because all the allocation of resources is based that the budget is completely spent. And this is based at the end on the budget formula. And therefore you need costs for your DH production, for the nursery selection, for the genomic selection, for hybrid seed production or line seed production, for a field plot, and some else, but these are the major costs you need. It's not much what you need. And at the end, all is redefined in field plot equivalents. That means when you have a 100,000 euro budget, then you define your DH, and you know that a field plot costs you 10 euro. You have to divide 100,000 by 10, then you have the number of plots you can spend as a total budget. And in parallel, you make the same for DH production. When you know one plot costs 10 euro, production of the DH line actually costs 40 euro for me in my system, then the cost is 4 times a field plot. Same for genomic selection. This is done because at the end the system runs allocation of resources based on plots, and therefore it can easily be transformed. A second, to look at the so-called nursery selection. We have this here. After we produce the line, we have a nursery selection where we can on the one hand multiply the seeds that we have enough for hybrid seed production or field testing. And in parallel, we have many traits which you can easily see in the field, like heavy disease infection or extremely lodging here, which maybe are not correlated to yield, but which are knockout traits. And therefore normally each breeder has a screening of his lines before he goes to expensive yield trials. We assume here a selection on traits which are not correlated to grain yield. It means it doesn't impact the selection gain formula at all. However, it has an impact on your costs. because we have to assume money, the costs, how much observation in a nursery costs. At the end, these costs affect the total budget, thus the higher the costs in the nursery, the less lines I can test, and thus you get indirectly also an effect on selection gain on grain yield. This nursery selection is also not optimized. It's predefined by you as a user, by the selected fraction alpha. That means you have an initial number of lines which are produced, and then you select a given fraction and 1 lines, and you define to the system how much lines you generally take here. Whatever, 10%, 20%, 30% are selected, and you give it before simulation directly to the system, and then it starts with this value, and don't optimize it. Now that was the rough frame, what can be done, what is required. Now a bit more into details, what input parameters do we need to have to run such a simulation. And for sure the first thing is the breeding scheme. And not many details, but we need roughly, for instance, put like here in an Excel table, the years, how much years are required, what you are doing when. Then maybe when you have some limitations, for instance, that you're not able to do more than 3 isolations for testers, or that the number of locations is limited, that you should define before. And really think about when you design a scheme here, you want all the time to be faster, to have a lower number of years, because this is at the end divided the divisor for the annual selection gain. But really think about when you design here the scheme, whether the amount of seed can be really produced in the speed. And this is also a function here, depending on the efficiency of the DH, multiplication, whatever, does also mean how many testers and locations are realistic. This is the first thing you need, and then you need your framework. The framework is on the one hand the budget for the whole breeding program. This includes the line production costs, the seed production, genomics, field testing. You need costs for following breeding operations, would be the line production, the seed production when you have specific costs, for instance hybrid seed production, field observation costs, yield plot costs, genomic costs. And all these are redefined like told in field plot equivalence. That means that these monetary values are divided by the costs of one field plot, which is in wheat at least the case around 30 euro. Then you need the variance components, which define at the end the crop and the trait. And you can take this easily from your breeders' trials, because you have each year tests of your advanced lines. And then you have, for instance, in my tests, I have wheat trials, I have the grain yield data from them from the ANOVA, then I can take the variance components out there, which can be used here for the simulation. We have to define the number of finally selected lines we want to have after our breeding scheme for pre-registration trials. We have to think about, do we use genomics? Yes, and if yes, what are the costs and what is the prediction ability? And we have to define the intensity of nursery selection. Just a feeling what have been past the last years my first nursery. 20 to 30%, I guess. In some cases even less. And this is roughly all what we have to define. And then we can go to running our scenarios. Thus we have all this data at hand, and then we start to define the basics. And this is first the budget in field plot equivalence. And then the crop and the trait to select for, which we take from the variance components. Based on these variance components, which are estimated in ANOVA by breeders' trials, we have here, for instance, the scenario for the phenotypic value in hybrid trials, where we select on general combining ability, and specific combining ability cannot be used in a recurrent selection. It's just at the end when we produce specific hybrid. From these variance components, the distribution of phenotypic values is constructed. And then we can go to the code. At the end, this is the start. We have to load the library. You can get a session info. You put in the budget, the variance components. You see here an example for hybrid wheat. We have 10,000 plots. When we assume a plot of 30 euro, that would be 300,000 euro. Then we have variance components. This is, like you can see here above, the general combining ability. This is the target variance we want to select for, and all the others are masking variances. This is the genotype by location interaction, the genotype by year interaction, the genotype by location by year interaction, and the error variance. And the same for specific combining ability. Here it's for the specific combining ability. This is the variance due to interaction specific combining ability with locations. The variance due to interaction specific combining ability with the years. And the variance specific combining ability times location times year effect. And you see in this example, like typically for most breeder trials, that we don't have these very particular variance components. We normally have only 1 year tests. Thus we have a genotype by environment variance, and we don't have the separation in year and location year interaction. Thus we put here the genotype by environment variance, and the other one we set to 0. And the same for specific combining ability as well. Then we have to define our breeding operations. Here, the nursery, we have to define a priori the intensity of nursery selection. That would be, for instance, 25%. We would define it as alpha equals 0.25. Genomic selection, if yes, we need a predictive ability, for instance 0.2, which is quite the reality for grain yield across different breeding cycles in wheat. Then we have to think about whether we use 2, 1 or 0 field stages, and whether we have maximum numbers of testers and locations, and we have to fix the costs for all the operations. And how this looks like, I want to show you now a bit more in detail. This is at the end all the code you need to run your simulation. Before you define the budget, the variance components, as we discussed already, you define also the number of finally selected lines you will end up when you run through here, putting here 300,000 euro. You want to get out here, for instance, 5 lines which go to registration trials. And then you run the system here, which includes a grid search on all possible allocations. With this function, it's called multi-stage optimum search. And here you have different figures you can play with, and where you can fix your costs and your grid where you search in detail. And I want now to show you stepwise what it is. Now, looking at the code, you have here called mass-f, which is nothing else than putting here inside a genomic prediction ability. When you make phenotypic selection, you put here an NA. If you make use of genomic selection, you put here your prediction ability. For instance, 0.2. Alpha nursery is the selected fraction disease nursery. In our situation, 0.25. This loads the variance components. I recommend you to define it a priori, prior to this function. Don't get lost when you want to change them. Here for the specific variance components as well. Then we come to the costs. Cost nursery has the function, once again, we have to define the cost to produce a single DH line, and the costs, how much does it cost to phenotype this DH line in the nursery on observation traits like heading, plant height, a disease, or similar things. Then we have a function cost production. Never change this 0, just from an older version, not yet skipped, let it as a 0. And you can here enter when you have specific seed production costs which are larger than the initial costs to produce a DH line. And a typical example would be when we make hybrid breeding, we have the DH line produced, but at the end we have to cross it to a tester, and these hybrid seed production costs are entered here. Cost for testing, similar. You have a first option here to put your costs for genomic selection. When you have no genomic selection, you put here a 0. If you have genomic selection, you put its costs. And also for yield plot in the first yield testing and in the second yield testing, you put here a value inside. T2 free equals true does mean in a situation where we have 2 stages of hybrid seed production. We assume that for the tester we use in the first stage, we have already produced in a single hybrid seed production enough seeds to test it at least 2 consecutive years in the field. Thus, when we have, for instance, in the first stage 1 tester and in the second stage of testing 4 testers, we have in the second stage 3 additional testers for which we need a budget 3 times the cost of a hybrid seed production of a single line, but we have used 4 testers because we have enough seeds from the tester of the first stage. When you make here a false, does mean you have to reproduce also the testers of the first hybrid seed production once again. Here is the number of finally selected lines you can define here inside. I recommend you define it outside, then the grid search is more easy. Budget is defined before, and then you have here the kernel of the optimization search. It's a grid search. Grid search does mean you say here for the first yield test, for the numbers of the DH lines tested in this yield test, you say I start with a number here, at least NF, that's what I want to select at the end, in our example 5, and I test all allocations up to 4011 if the budget is sufficient. If it gets too expensive, the system stops itself. And we make it stepwise by 10. That means I start here with 5 and calculate my how many locations and testers and whatever I can use to spend all the budget. Then I use 5 plus 10 means 15, calculate the other scenario. Then I use 15 plus 10, 25, and so on. And this is similar for the number of lines in the second field stage, similar for the number of test locations in stage 1 and 2 of field tests, and the number of testers in stage 1 and 2. For replications, we don't have a grid search. You say a priori how many replications you use. This is specific because we know already as long as a different location costs you the same money, a yield plot at a different location, then a second replication at a given location. And it costs the same money, then it's all the time more worth to invest in a higher number of locations than replications, which is shown in many simulations. Thus, we fix it here, and when we don't optimize it, that means when you want to have a higher number of replications, you must do it manually and run separately. Let's go a bit more in details. We look at the scheme. We produce the DH lines. Then we had at first the nursery. And you can see once again in the code where are the factors for the nursery you should put into. This is on the one hand the alpha nursery, which is the selected fraction in the nursery. And on the other hand, it's the costs which arise here in the nursery. The 1 stands here for the cost to produce the DH line. And 1 does mean it costs as much as a yield plot to produce a single line. In our example would be 30 euro. And the second number here is the costs for the nursery tests. Screening the line in a nursery on single easy to measure traits like plant height, heading or a disease, which would be 0.3. Yield plots in our situation would be roughly 10 euro. 30 divided by 3. This is the nursery. Let's go to genomic selection as the next step. When we want to have genomic selection, we have to put here a prediction ability. When we don't want to have it, we put here NA. That we put here a value, for instance 0.2, and in the test we have to put here in the first stage the costs for the genomic selection. And a 2 does mean it's twice expensive to genotype a single line with whole dense marker. That would be in our situation, including DNA extraction and all logistics behind and data analysis, 60 euro per line. Then we go to hybrid seed production. And hybrid seed production is nothing else than costs here for production. And in our situation, it would be factor 4, means to produce a single hybrid, one DH line crossed to a single tester costs 4 times a yield plot, which is a typical scenario in hybrid wheat, where hybrid seed production is complicated and thus very expensive. That would in our case be 4 times 30 euro equals 120 euro. And the second number here is for the second hybrid seed production. And for sure in the cost function, this is at the end multiplied by the number of testers and the DH line you use at these stages. When we go to the first yield test, you have in the cost tests here at the second position to put into the cost for a field plot, and as we all define in field plot equivalence, this is a 1. And then we have the grid which is running here in the first stage of yield tests. That means we run a grid across the number of lines, number of test locations, number of testers, and number of replications we use. In our scenario would be this, the grid runs from the number of finally selected lines, which would be 5 in our situation, up to 4011, stepwise by 10. That means it starts with 5, and makes 15, and makes 25, and vice versa. When we have here 25 lines, it calculates then the possible allocation here and here, so that the total amount of money of available budget is used. For the L2 grid, does mean we start with 2 locations, that we don't allow the system to calculate for 1 location. And this is done, at least I do it, because I assume unreplicated trial, and I don't want to take the risk having a single location trial with only 1 replication. That means when I lose this trial due to terrible weather conditions or a pig or whatever running around, then I would have no data. And I let it run from minimum 2 to maximum 5 locations and stepwise. And I say here, I have only 1 tester. Same holds true for the second stage of field testing. We have here the costs, tests. In the third position, we enter once again a 1 because we define it in field plot equivalence. And then we have the grid, similar to even already explained one slide before, for the second stage. And then at the end you get an output which is looking a bit bizarre, which gives you the number you have defined. You finally select, you get the optimum allocation which would be in this situation here, 2028 initial lines. Then the third number is N1. We have here assumed first a phenotypic selection. That means we don't have here lines. And then we have N2, N3, and so on. The values of Bini, B1, B2, and B3 and budget can be neglected. And at the end, the latest value here, the gain, is the absolute selection gain we get out of the scheme. This is not very comfortable, thus we build up soon a table out of it. I will show you soon. Here we have now the situation where we calculate the GSrapid. It would be a scheme using phenotypic, no, not using phenotypic, but using genomic selection. But we use genomic selection, and in addition we skip 1 year of field testing, assuming that this genomic selection here is as good as 1 year field testing. And this is realized by for sure putting here by mass F the prediction ability, by putting costs here 2, and as we have skip here the third stage of testing, we have to put here cost production. We don't produce once again hybrid seeds, we have a 0. We don't test them once again, also 0. And then the grid N3 we don't need to run. We stay here, we have a number of finally selected lines, 5. Don't run it, you calculate once 5, 5, and that's it. And you don't run the grid. And then you get here the output as well. And at the end, this is here your absolute selection gain you get out. And from this data sheet, once again, you can skip Bini, B1, B2, B3, and budget. And you can take the data information and put it on a table. And the main thing you should put in this table is the breeding scheme. And we did use a phenotypic scheme and a GS scheme. You get then an ini number of initial lines in the phenotypic scheme. You don't get N1 because this is line only for genomics. We get a number of N2, which is in the first hybrid seed production and yield test. We get N3, which are in the second hybrid seed production and yield test. We get L2, which is the optimum number of test locations in the field test 1, and L3, the optimum number in the second yield test. And similar for testers, number 1 here for number of testers in the first yield test, and 5 testers are optimum in the second yield test. And then you get the absolute selection gain and just have to divide it by the number of years you need to finish a breeding cycle, which is in our situation 8 years, and then you get the annual selection gain. Similarly, you take from the previous slide the results for the genomic selection rapid. There you have for sure here a number of lines which go to genomic selection. You have a first year of phenotyping with N2 lines, L2 testers, and T2 testers, but you have no third yield test, and therefore you have no value here. And you will get a selection gain, and you once again divide it by the number of years which is required to finish this breeding cycle, which would be in our case 6 years. And from this table you can then get a lot of information. This is the optimum allocation of test resources. And when you compare it, you see that the higher number of lines is tested here in field plots, slightly higher in nursery, but especially here in the field plots, the yield plots, than in the genomic breeding scheme, where you have only at the end 155 lines which are pushed on 3 testers in 3 locations, in 10 locations. But almost the same amount than here is done on a genomic selection. And you see the annual and absolute selection gain The absolute selection gain is higher for the phenotypic scheme, but the annual selection gain is higher for the genomic scheme because it has 2 years less. And then we have a big difference here. And when we compare the two breeding schemes in the optimum allocation, we see that in the phenotypic scheme we test a higher number of lines really in yield plots, which is considerably reduced in the genomic breeding scheme. Why? Because we test them on their genomic breeding value. For line breeding, it's the same way, but we don't have this hybrid seed production. We don't have then in the field test the number of testers. And we don't have specific combining ability variance components. Thus you set them to 0. And the GCA component is at the end here the genotypic variance. This is the genotype by environment variance and the error variance. And for the cost production, we can put here a 0 and 0 for hybrid seed production because we don't produce hybrids. And for the tester grid you set to 1, then it doesn't run. And then you can calculate, like before, different breeding schemes for line breeding. Thus, to conclude, the optimization of breeding programs is quite forward with the R package selection gain, and you have quite low requirements to the computing power. That means you can even run it on small laptops. And it's first time you have really a tool where you just define budget, variance components, your breeding scheme, and then the optimum allocation is run by the system and you get it directly out. You don't need to write a lot of loops in R or where else to get this optimization. It's done already. You need only few input parameters, making its use easy because we as breeders have many things we run in parallel and everything, but we don't have very detailed data on many operations. Thus, this is really easy. You only need few data, and furthermore, to our opinion, the less input you need, the less assumptions you have to take, and the more robust is the model. Which is very often forgotten in scientific studies is that breeding programs have a fixed annual budget. And thus a fair comparison must be made based on a fixed budget, thinking that this fixed budget is spent each year. And this is the basis of this package, which is also a bit different than other packages have been realized. Further advantage of the package is we are currently continue its development. We want to have more flexibility in breeding schemes, and for sure we are interested to realize a method that we can also select in parallel, not only on a single trait, but maybe at least for 2 traits in parallel. But this is not yet done. We are dealing it actually in the background in a beta version. And with this, I want to thank you for your interest. And if you have any question, just contact